When you ask someone what's the fastest way to level stuff in Warframe, they will usually tell you stealth farming. But why? Well, the easy and somewhat obvious answer is that you can get upwards of 500% extra affinity when killing unaware enemies. The way this works is when you kill an unaware enemy, you get a 30-second buff that increases affinity gained by 100%, and this stacks up to 5 times. Now, this can be done by either going into stealth with a stealth frame or by actually crowd controlling the enemies before they have the chance to become aware of you. Now, how do we know if an enemy is alerted or not? Well, your best bet is actually going to be the minimap or the large overlay map. If the enemy strangle is empty, you're good to go, but if the enemy strangle is filled in, they're alerted and you're better off skipping them because it takes the enemies a while to calm down after they saw something suspicious. One of the most popular ways of doing this nowadays is to actually subsume Silence, a Banshee ability, onto your Warframe. This creates a sound dampening aura that deafens enemies and also stuns them when they first get exposed to it. This does have a downside though. The enemies are deaf, not blind, so they can still see you, which is why I actually prefer to subsume Equinox's Rest. This allows you to put enemies to sleep, which means they're fully crowd controlled rather than just being deaf. Though make sure you have the right emissive color to actually use Rest rather than Rage, which is not great for stealth farming. Now this is actually somewhat necessary nowadays because of Eximus units. Eximus units give a ton of XP, but you can't crowd control them without alerting them first. They're actually really annoying. And while you can just go in stealth and it works well enough, it's difficult to clear a room of enemies without alerting any of them. Your best bet is going to be an AoE weapon that's been silenced, because no one's gonna see you if they're all dead. But that unfortunately limits the things you can level, because if you're on your own, you actually need to kill stuff with the weapon you want to level in order to feed it affinity. And even then, it's only getting 50% of the affinity, because the other 50% goes to your Warframe. This is so that you don't rip your hair out when you're leveling something like Loki. Now, because of all of these restrictions and the faff associated with stealth farming, I genuinely don't think it's the best way of leveling anymore. It's really fast if done right, yes, but thanks to the addition of Steel Path as well as a bunch of new missions, just playing the game normally is more than good enough. But if that is a little bit too slow for you and you would like something a little bit faster, you can do what's known as a leeching. Leeching has gotten a bit of a bad rep over the years because of some people that like to leech very passively. But leeching isn't necessarily bad. You can have 4 leeches in one squad and it still works. It doesn't work as well as if you have someone doing the majority of the damage and killing, but it still works, as long as you understand the mechanics behind it, i.e. affinity sharing. Affinity sharing is a little bit complicated, but it's not too complicated. I've already mentioned a small part of it where if you kill something with a weapon, 50% of the affinity goes to the weapon and 50% goes to your Warframe. In addition to that though, if you kill something with a Warframe ability, 100% of the affinity goes to the Warframe. That's pretty straightforward, but on top of that, 100% of the affinity you gain from the kill is then duplicated twice. The first duplication goes to your companion, and if your companion has a weapon, it will then be split 50-50 between the companion and the weapon, which means that if you want to level something like a Sentinel or a Moa, but not necessarily its weapon, you want to take the weapon off. Because even if an item is maxed out, it will still eat its fair share of affinity. It's actually how you generate focus via a lens. It's the excess of affinity being fed into a maxed out item. The second duplication is why leeching works, because when you kill something, 100% of the affinity you gain from the kill is then duplicated to any ally within the affinity sharing range, which at base is 50 meters, or 250 meters in open world missions. The thing about shared affinity though is that the split is different. 25% of shared affinity goes towards the frame and the rest is split amongst equipped weapons. This makes leeching pretty bad for leveling frames because no matter what, you're only feeding it 25% of the affinity, but it's really good for leveling weapons. There is a reason why when you go to Hydron or any other popular leeching spot, people run around with only 1 equipped weapon. Because when you unequip 2 out of your 3 weapons, it forces 75% of the shared affinity to go to that 1 weapon. This gives you a better ratio than killing the enemies on your own. And it's the main reason why leeching is still very popular, even though it's not quite as fast as stealth farming. With the second reason being, well, it's just a lot more chill. And you can do it anywhere. You don't even have to be a passive leech. You can still fight with the weapon, because if you kill something with it, you're still getting 50% of the affinity. So you don't have to be a passive leech that moves around just enough so that the game still feeds you shared affinity, because just in case you didn't know, if you AFK in a mission, the game will actually stop feeding you shared affinity, and it happens pretty fast. You don't have to be AFK for too long. So what you do is you just play missions normally, you just unequip the other two weapons so that more of the shared affinity is fed into the weapon you actually want to level. The way I see it is if you prefer to do things solo or you just want to use the fastest method possible, stealth farming is a great option. But if you prefer to do things in a squad or you would like to get other stuff done at the same time, then leeching is the way to go. Because as I've mentioned already, you can leech anywhere. You can leech while farming resources, relics, while cracking relics, while running bosses. It doesn't matter. One thing I will say though is that I absolutely despise passive leeches. So if you're gonna leech, either make sure that your one weapon is equipped well enough to deal with the mission or bring a useful frame. Don't just stand there on an Excalibur with an auto clicker making sure you're still being fed affinity, because everyone, including myself, will hate you. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but if you are gonna do it, I would highly recommend you either do it with your friends or clanmates and you don't burden public squads with it. Now, one thing I want to stress here is that the difference between leeching and stealth farming isn't as big as you might think. People like to make a big deal out of it, but it's really not. It doesn't take that much time to level a weapon by leeching. The difference is usually going to be a few minutes. The biggest difference you'll notice is with leveling Warframes, because when you're stealth farming, you're feeding 50% of all the affinity into the frame with a 500% multiplier, whereas when you're leeching, you're only getting 25%. Which is pretty noticeable. Now, one more thing I want to talk about here is affinity farming for operators, because that one is a little bit strange. Basically, when you kill an enemy with your operator's ability or the amp, it will feed 100% of the affinity to the amp. Makes sense. But affinity shared by other squad members does something strange. Only 37.5% of the affinity actually makes it into your amp, because for whatever reason the game feeds 25% of the affinity to the operator and 37.5% of the affinity to your operator's melee weapon. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but operators don't level up and they don't have melee weapons, so most of the affinity that's shared with you is actually lost, which means that leeching on an operator is a really bad idea unless you have a really weak operator with a weak amp or your squad mates can kill stuff incredibly fast. So this was a pretty long explanation of how affinity farming works and why certain methods are more popular than others. I could have just focused on stealth farming, give you some examples, and tada, we are basically done. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to explain everything because you now also understand how to farm focus. Because, and I've mentioned this in the video already, focus is based on affinity. When you put a lens on an item and you max that item out, it then looks at the affinity that's being fed into that item and it converts that affinity into focus based on the tier of the lens. This is why items only generate focus when they're maxed out. And when you know how affinity is distributed in the game, you can make far better choices when it comes to putting lenses on items. Now, this only really matters in the beginning when you don't have a lot of lenses to throw around, because eventually you can just put lenses on everything. But if you've been paying attention, you know that if you mostly play solo, your best bet is probably going to be a Warframe. Ideally, a Warframe that can do a lot of damage on its own, because... that is correct. If you kill an enemy with a Warframe ability, all the affinity is fed into the Warframe. If you're doing stealth farming, you want to put the lens on the Warframe and or the weapon you're using to kill the enemies, because the split is roughly going to be 50-50. Now again, you're better off putting lenses on everything eventually, because then it works no matter what, but when you have a limited amount of lenses in the beginning, make sure you put them on the right stuff. This is why I like to explain why stuff works and how it works, rather than just tell you to do something because it's the best, because it allows you to make informed decisions and utilize it properly. But anyway, I think that's enough rambling for today, so I thank you very much for watching. As always guys, I hope you've enjoyed the video and found it helpful, and I would also like to extend a special thank you to all the channel members. Thank you very much guys, I really appreciate your support. And I'll see you next time. Bye bye. Especially if you understand what especially if you understand what I believe to be the... What is that sentence? Especially if you understand what I believe to be the best way of... Why did I choose this sentence? Oh no.